That story shortly, but first the federal parliament held its first sitting of the year today with an emotional speech from the Prime Minister Julia Gillard as she paid tribute to victims of the Queensland floods. As well, at a news conference, the opposition outlined $2 billion worth of savings it says should be made to pay for the flood clean-up, rather than Labor's combination of cuts and a one-off flood levy. Opposition leader Tony Abbott has targeted water buybacks, car industry assistance and overseas aid to Indonesian schools as areas to be hit. In the meantime, the government is conducting behind-the-scenes negotiations with independents and Greens to secure the passage of its levy. Shortly, I'll be joined by Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey, but first, Matt Peacock reports.
I know in my electorate that people are feeling a lot of sympathy, but also are amazed by the courage of all these people that have been affected by this natural disaster.
As a nation, this is a time of healing. Obviously, the Queensland people, Victorians and now West Australians have all been struggling with grief, with heartache.
Canberra today was awash with sympathy for the victims of the recent natural disasters, and nobody more so than a tremulous Prime Minister, Julia Gillard.
Mr Speaker, I've brought with me today a mud-splattered, tattered Australian flag, and I want to show it to the House. It was recovered from the area of Murphy's Creek by the crew of a Defence Force helicopter, and I was honoured when they gave it to me. It was muddy and it was soaking wet, and they did so because it was a powerful symbol for them of what it means to face the elements, of what it means to be heard, of what it means to endure, of what it means to be Australian.
Beyond the immediate emotional impact of the floods, though, is how to pay for the damage. The opposition leader, Tony Abbott, still staunchly resisting the government's planned flood levy, insisting that cutbacks should pay for it all.
We need to find additional savings to fund flood reconstruction because we have a government which has been utterly profligate with taxpayers' money.
The government's already cutting billions from a string of renewable initiatives, leading the sole Greens member, Adam Bant, to suggest cutting business welfare instead.
There's many other ways that the money could be found that is proposed to be found through cuts. If we, for example, just deferred the proposed tax cut for big business from 2013 to 2014, we'd save somewhere in the order of about $1.6 billion on our figures.
And independent Tony Windsor's suggested cuts to middle-class welfare. His fellow independent, though, Andrew Wilkie, wonders why make cuts at all?
The whole flood funding package relies on funding cutbacks, including cutting funding for some carbon reduction programs such as solar, some education cutbacks in tertiary education. I'm not keen on that. And quite frankly, I don't know why we just can't run the budget deficit another 12 months.
Some senior economists agree. This is the UK government's debt as a percentage of GDP. This is the public debt in the US. And this is Japan's, nearly 200% of GDP, all compared with Australia's relatively tiny 22%. But the opposition today identified the fat it says should be slashed to pay for these disasters.
The largest single saving is $600 million in deferrals of water buybacks. We're not saying that the money should be spent, but we think that the money should be spent at a time when the government is not faced with the sort of demands that it currently has. There is obviously an abundance of water around right now.
The car industry, already seething from the government's axing of the Green Car Innovation Fund, would lose another $500 million under the opposition. It also cut nearly that in aid to Indonesian schools.
If the Indonesian schools program turns out to be something of high value, we're prepared to look at it again down the track. But with so many schools destroyed or damaged in Australia, we do think that charity begins at home.
If the levy is to become law, the government needs the support of the independents and the Greens in this knife-edged parliament. And already negotiations with Greens leader Bob Brown are underway.
Now, it can see us as a good ideas bank, responsibly improving a package it's developed, somewhat on the run, or it can play hardball. I would recommend it takes the good ideas from the Greens and gets on with the business of delivering this much-needed money to the victims of these horrific floods.
The appointment of former Liberal Premier and Federal Finance Minister John Fahey to oversee the levy has impressed that almost coalition member who's not, WA National Tony Crook, who's pledged support for the one-off tax.
I know John from a previous life and he's a very, very capable man. In fact, I think it's a very good choice. So, you know, all of those things together, I think it actually enhances the fact that we will get value for money. And what you have to remember in all of this is that the government is clearly on notice now. You know, this program has to work for the government.
Beyond today's politics lay the tragedy of recent events, dramatically recounted by a deeply moved Prime Minister Julia Gillard in the personal story of Mark Kempton, a helicopter pilot in the floods.
A woman he rescued who wept uncontrollably as she was pulled into the helicopter. In a media report, Mark said, "I looked over my shoulder and I saw her sitting on the floor of the aircraft and she was devastated. It was heartbreaking." What Mark was witnessing was a young pregnant mother who just seconds before the chopper had arrived had had her young child wrenched from her weary arms by the flood waters. She finally succumbed to the terrifying power of nature that night.
Matt Peacock with that report.